Welcome, brave souls, to the chilling depths of horror and detail. Today we are going to share Wendigo and Skinwalker encounter horror stories. First story. I don't need you to believe me either. Okay, let me start. At the age of 13 or so, my elder brother and I were walking home from what was essentially a youth center, where you participated in various activities. At the time, my brother was 16. This happened around October. We chose to walk rather than use the bus since it was getting close to 10 o'clock at night, and the youth center wasn't far from our house. We live on a farm quite remote from the city with 3 or 4 neighbors. If we were to take the bus, we would have to wait for approximately an hour. We therefore had to walk on a large road to get home. However, we reasoned that since it was becoming late, no automobiles would be out. We hosted a horror night at the youth center this evening. In essence, we watched scary movies and played horror games. I'll pass on the dull stuff. We heard footsteps when we were around 200 meters from our house, near the bus stop outside our farm. Be aware that there are fields all around this bus stop where corn is grown in the fall. My brother came to a stop and pivoted. I turned to face him after noticing he had stopped walking and asked him why. I turned to face my brother, who has his back to me and is still. And I honestly don't care if you believe me or not, because what I'm about to write is so weird. I still find it horrifying what I see when I peer over my brother's shoulder. A gory, skinned moose is standing on its 2 legs in front of me. It stood there, staring at my brother with eyes that were all white. My brother is whispering my name to me and directing me to run. I just stood there, shocked and immobilized by fear, without saying anything. My brother mumbled something that I don't recall, but then he turned around, grabbed my arm, and took off sprinting. Never in my life have I run that quickly. My brother has never scared me the way that I have. We dashed home, and the entire way I could hear people scurrying after us. However, I was wiser to look back then. Upon arriving home, my brother started crying. He'd informed my mom what had happened, and he was crying like a crazy person. My brother and I shared a room back then. His bed was near the entryway, and mine was by the window. We slept through most of the night, and there are 2 causes. First and foremost, we saw a fucking moose running after us while standing on 2 legs. Secondly, we could hear footsteps and scratching coming from outside our bedroom wall all night long, like a dog romping around. The people next door don't own any pets. We had a 2nd-floor apartment. My brother has never been open to discussing what transpired that evening to this day. I apologize for my poor writing, but I'm still learning about this. What did my brother and I observe that evening? I've seen and heard strange things my entire life, but nothing like this. Even in the middle of the day, I can't walk to the bus stop by myself after that night. Even though we currently reside next door, I still think the entire farm is haunted. Second story. Saw another Skinwalker story on here earlier. Here's my experiences with them. Growing up, I lived in northeastern Arizona, literally about 5 miles south of the Navajo Reservation in Winslow. Naturally, being that close to the reservation, or the res, skinwalkers were a huge topic of conversation amongst the locals, and we all took it very seriously. Stories of personal experiences abounded. I was no different. Well, to start off my set of stories, I was about 9 or so. My family had gone camping in a little spot about 50 miles or so south of town called Heart Canyon, near Wiggins Crossing, if anyone is interested. We had been there all day, and I was extremely familiar with the area as we had camped there 20 or so times before. So, my parents let me just wander about alone in the woods. This was back in the early 90s. Anyway, I had some G.I. Joes that I had been playing with in the nearby creek, about 80 yards from our campsite. There were not other campers there with us. My mom had called me back to camp for dinner, so I left and ate. Played around camp for a while, and realized that I'd forgotten my toys back at the creek. So I took a flashlight and headed back that way. I knew right where I had left them, so in no time I found them and grabbed them up. As I was squatted down to grab them on the edge of the water, a sudden urgency that I'd never felt before ran down my spine. I remember feeling frozen because of the fear. Like the little boy on E.T. when the alien comes out of the field for the first time and he's trying to scream for his family. I looked up and pointed my flashlight to the other side of the creek and about 10 yards down the way. I saw something. At first, I thought it was a deer, but it was standing up, so I thought it may be a bear. But it was too skinny and not enough poofy hair. It skunked behind a tree and peered out slightly at me. I seriously was too scared to move. I had just read a bit about Bigfoot for the first time, since it wasn't really popular in my area. I thought for a long time that's what I saw. I finally had seen enough to gather my wits and scram as fast as I could back to camp. I told my parents and they kind of dismissed it as my imagination. So I just stayed close the rest of the trip. About 2 years later, I was at my house. I had 2 dogs. They were outside dogs, lived their whole lives in my backyard. One night they went psycho, barking at first at something in the alley behind my house. Then they both started whimpering. I had my window open slightly, and one of my dogs straight up jumped up to the window, frantically chewed through the screen of the window, forced its way into the house, and would not leave the house for 3 days. Another time when I was about 13, we used to play night games in the town. Mostly, there being nothing much else to do, we would walk around our neighborhood and act suspicious, so the cops would come chase us around. And we run down the alleyways and hop into random folks' backyards to hide. Now, it was extremely common to see an intoxicated Navajo or Hopi in the alley, or the street. So it was no big deal to see one in the alley behind my house that night as we being 2 of my friends and myself, ran from a police car hot on our tail. We saw him plain as day standing in our way. We ran around him and jumped into the nearest yard to hide. We waited for the cop to pass us and hopped back out. Literally about 3 minutes went by. We ran back the way we came, and as we got to the point where the Indian had been, he was gone. Legit, in his place was a coyote sitting there watching us. We ran right past it, feet from it, and anyone who knows coyotes knows they will bail out way before you get close to them. This bugger held his ground and calmly sat and watched us run past him. We all freaked out and stayed inside for a month. My last experience was when I was about 15 or 16. My brother has a girlfriend that lived in a small community south of Winslow called Starlight Pines, about 25 miles-ish. Well, we went to go see her one day, and as we drove out, about 15 miles out we saw an Indian guy standing on the side of the road, which was quite odd because the res was north of town, and it was rare to see anyone on foot south of town because it's just desert and forest for literally 80 miles. Anyway, we see this guy. He looked normal enough. Flannel shirt, jeans. We got to our destination and hung out with my brother's GF and her family well into the night when we decided to head back home. Hopped in his truck, a Chevy S10, and drove back the way we came. In the same spot we saw the Indian dude. He was still there. I remember thinking, that dude is crazy standing out there all day and into the night. What's he doing? Right as we passed him, we hear a loud bang on the back of the truck. At first I thought we hit an animal, but I hadn't felt anything that we'd run over. I turned around and looked out the back window. My brother started to slow down, thinking there may be something wrong with the truck. In the brake lights, I see the Indian guy chasing after us. We were easily going 55 to 60 at this point as we were about to stop. The guy is in the road, feet behind us. I scream at my brother to not stop. Gun it, man. Gun it. He does, and being a Chevy S10, it had a speed governor on it at 80. 2 miles. 2 miles. This guy keeps up with us. We are seriously freaking out. I asked my brother, what if we don't make it back to town? Or what about when we have to slow down once we get close? After those 2 miles that stretched forever, I looked back, and he was gone. We got home, booked it into the house, and told our parents. Next morning, I get up to head somewhere and look at my brother's truck thinking about the night before. I wondered what the loud bang was just before we started getting chased. Inspecting the truck, I found a handprint smeared in the dust from about 2 to 3 over to the right, then smeared to the right taillight. I never went there again. Sorry it was so long. But those are my experiences with what I'm convinced were skinwalkers. Third story. Forest encounter. I've never told anyone this story because I thought no one would believe me. But after seeing the Fears to Fathom games, I feel compelled to share my experience so others can know the truth. This is the story of the time I encountered a Wendigo in Beaver Mines, Alberta. It was the summer of 2018 when my friends, Tim, Caleb, and I decided to go on a camping trip. We were in the 10th grade, looking for an adventure before school started again. Beaver Mines, with its dense forests and serene lakes, seemed like the perfect spot. We packed our gear, grabbed some snacks, and headed out for what was supposed to be a week-long trip, excited to spend some time away from the hustle and bustle of everyday life. The first day was perfect. We set up our tent, roasted marshmallows over the campfire, and shared ghost stories. The stars were bright, and the air was cool and crisp. We felt like we were the only people in the world. That night, as we were drifting off to sleep, I heard something moving outside our tent. It was a soft rustling, like leaves being disturbed. I brushed it off as an animal, but Tim and Caleb heard it too. We decided to investigate, thinking it might be a deer or a raccoon. As we shone our flashlights into the trees, we saw a pair of glowing eyes staring back at us from the darkness. They were unnaturally high off the ground, and the figure they belonged to was tall and gaunt. The creature didn't move. It just stood there watching us. We backed away slowly and retreated to our tent, trying to convince ourselves that it was just our imagination. But deep down, we knew something was wrong. The next day, we tried to enjoy our trip, but the memory of those eyes lingered. We decided to go for a hike to clear our minds. As we were walking through the forest, we stumbled upon a gruesome scene. A deer carcass lay on the ground, its body torn apart as if by some massive, savage creature. The air was thick with the smell of blood and decay. We heard a noise and looked up to see the same creature from the previous night, hunched over another deer, devouring it with feral intensity. Its skin was stretched tight over its bones, and its eyes were hollow, filled with an insatiable hunger. We froze in terror, watching as it tore into the deer's flesh. When it looked up and saw us, it let out a bone-chilling scream, a sound that echoed through the forest and sent shivers down our spines. We ran back to our campsite, our hearts pounding in our chests. We knew we had to leave, but the sun was setting, and we didn't want to risk getting lost in the dark. That evening, as we sat around the campfire, trying to regain some sense of normalcy, we heard the sound of branches snapping in the distance. I stood up, shining my flashlight towards the noise. We saw the Wendigo again, its skeletal frame partially hidden behind a tree. It was closer this time, and it seemed to be observing us with a sinister intelligence. We decided to sleep in shifts, with one of us always keeping watch. During Caleb's watch, I was jolted awake by his frantic whispering. "It's getting closer," he said, his voice trembling. The Wendigo was now just a few feet from our campsite, its eyes glowing in the darkness. We could hear its ragged breathing and the crunch of leaves under its feet as it circled our tent. On the third night, we decided to go for a hike, hoping to clear our minds and escape the oppressive fear. The forest was eerily quiet, and we tried to ignore the unsettling feeling that we were being watched. As we rounded a bend in the trail, the Wendigo emerged from the darkness, its grotesque form towering over us. It let out a guttural roar that reverberated through the trees, and we took off running. We sprinted down the trail, our breath coming in ragged gasps. The Wendigo's footsteps pounded behind us, growing louder and more menacing with each passing second. Desperate to escape, we veered off the trail and hid in the dense brush, hoping the thick foliage would conceal us. The Wendigo's growls were now close, and we could hear it crashing through the undergrowth, searching for us. When it seemed like it was getting too close, we made a quick decision to hide in the nearest porta-potties we could find, hoping they would offer some protection. We squeezed into the cramped spaces, trying to stay as silent as possible. The creature's heavy breathing and scratching noises outside were nearly unbearable. After what felt like hours, the Wendigo's sounds faded away, and we cautiously emerged from our hiding spots. We were shaken, but we knew we couldn't stay another night. That night, we huddled together in the tent, too scared to sleep. We heard footsteps circling our campsite, and the creature's low, guttural growls filled the air. At one point, we saw its shadow pass by the tent, its elongated limbs casting eerie shapes on the fabric. In the dead of night, I woke up to find the tent's entrance partially unzipped. Peering out, I saw the Wendigo standing at the edge of our campsite, watching us with those haunting eyes. It was as if it was waiting for the perfect moment to strike. We stayed awake until dawn, clutching our makeshift weapons, but the Wendigo never attacked. It was toying with us, feeding off our fear. As soon as the first light of day broke through the trees, we packed up our gear and bolted for the parking lot. We didn't speak. We just moved as fast as we could, our instincts screaming at us to get away. When we reached the parking lot, we threw our stuff into the car and jumped in, our hearts racing. Just as we were about to drive away, I looked out the window and saw the Wendigo standing at the edge of the lot, its eyes locked onto mine. It didn't move, but its presence was a terrifying reminder of what we had experienced. We sped away, leaving beaver mines and the Wendigo behind. Since that trip, I've never gone camping again. The memory of the Wendigo haunts me, a constant reminder of the terror we faced. What was supposed to be a week-long trip ended abruptly after just 4 days. I hope that by sharing this story, others will be aware of the dangers that lurk in the shadows, waiting to prey on the unsuspecting. Fourth story, my Skinwalker experience. Sorry it has taken me a while to post this. Been extremely busy lately, unfortunately. First off, I've told this story before in a public setting around 2008. I was living in Louisiana at the time and had called into Coast to Coast AM and told this story to George Norrie, which was a pretty cool experience. I didn't have a whole lot of time to tell some of the details, so you'll be getting the unedited version, so to speak. It happened somewhere between 1997 to 1999. I was in my late teens, and we were living in New Mexico up near the Four Corners. My parents were pastors at a local church in a very small town. We had lived outside of town, sort of out in the middle of nowhere, and there were a few houses sprinkled around us. Surrounding was, at least where there were no houses, there was some brush and a lot of desert. Ever since we moved there, the locals told us about skinwalkers. Even people in the church warned us about them. One guy in the church swore up and down that when he was a truck driver, he saw a skinwalker in its human form running alongside his truck when we was going about 80 miles per hour. But since I didn't witness it, I just took him at his word. I had heard many different tales on the origins of the skinwalkers, both from the locals and the Native Americans. There was a Native American who went to our church who still held on to his Navajo beliefs, who told me what I always assumed to be a more accurate description. He told me that when people of his tribe had a child out of incest, the tribe leaders take the baby out into the desert to be raised by wolves. The wolves would raise it, and they would become skinwalkers, having the powers to turn into anything, animals, humans, etc. The story fascinated me. He just seemed to know for sure that this was the accurate tale. Then he warned me to never whistle at night, which I thought was pretty weird, but I never did until one night. It was in the fall, around 11 o'clock at night. I was in my bedroom, which was the furthest room from anyone in the house, and near the garage, watching TV or playing PlayStation. My mother was in her bedroom. My dad was at the church studying, as he always did, till around midnight. My brother had a friend over that night, and they were going to spend the night on the back patio, which was a long rectangular room with screen windows all down it. Like I said, I was in my bedroom minding my business when my brother and his friend come banging on my door. Annoyed, I opened the door, and my brother, who is 4 years younger than me, and his friend are both frightened. My brother said, as they were in the patio, goofing off, they heard someone walking around the backyard and saw what looked to be the top of a white bald head walk by the screen windows. Now, normally I would believe my brother since he would never make this kind of stuff up, but his friend was a huge liar and had told tall tales about having been to Mars, even showing us the red dirt, which looked an awful lot like the red dirt you could find throughout the area, I might add. Of course, by this time I had experienced a lot of paranormal stuff, but I was still skeptical. Bravely and annoyed, I grabbed my jacket and a flashlight, and the three of us went out to the patio. It was always creepy at night because it was always so dark, and the only light came from a nearby lamppost a few yards down the street. Our backyard was insanely small except for the right-hand side of it, which was a bit bigger but held a trampoline which took up the better part of it. We stepped out of the patio, my flashlight shining around the yard, but saw nothing. That was when I started hearing the crunching of leaves coming from the front yard, so the three of us went through the back gate to the front yard. Now our front yard was huge and had roughly 9 apple trees. There was even a large creepy tree in the corner of the yard near the street I always stayed clear of for some reason. We had a close neighbor, literally on the other side of the wooden fence. It was a nice family that had a daughter about my brother's age, and they also had a bunch of chickens, and sometimes they would wander into our yard. So that is what I thought was walking around our front yard. Shining the flashlight around, of course, I couldn't see any chickens, but I did see something white walk behind a tree near the wooden fence. That was when I got very curious. The three of us walked slowly to the tree. I was being the protective big brother and kept the other two behind me. Before I knew it, I heard a loud whoosh and felt a gust of wind like something flew by us. My brother screamed out in pain. My brother always had his shirt off, which annoyed me because back then I was overweight and very self-conscious. But I noticed on his chest he had 3 long scratches across him. Scared and shocked, my brother ran back inside the house, leaving me and his friend. It all happened so quickly, but I ran towards the street where I was sure whatever it was had gone, his friend close behind me. Once we reached the end of our property, I could hear the sound of bare feet running down the paved road. I shined my light towards the sound, but never saw anything. So I whistled some tune, and from down the road, I heard the same tune whistle back to me. Intrigued, I whistled again, this time a different tune, and again the same tune was whistled back. My brother's friend started getting scared and kept trying to get me to go back inside, but I was very intrigued. I whistled for the 3rd time, and that was when, very close by, we both heard a male voice say, "Hey kid, come here." There was no hesitation, the two of us bolted back inside. We went to go tell my mother what happened, and she was already frightened because she was tending to my brother's scratches on his chest. We told her what happened, and my mother told us to stay inside. My mother has had some pretty scary paranormal encounters before. I need to tell those stories soon as well. So she believed us. I have never forgotten that encounter. My brother brushes it off these days, making out to be not a big deal, but I know differently, as does my mother. It's one of the main incidents in my life that literally bothers me to this day. 5th story. The creature in the woods. It was a crisp autumn evening when my friends and I decided to go camping in the remote woods for the weekend. We were all excited to escape the city and immerse ourselves in the tranquility of nature. By the time we arrived, night had already fallen, so we hurriedly set up our tents and lit a fire, the flickering flames casting long, dancing shadows around our campsite. As we sat around the fire, we began telling ghost stories, each one more chilling than the last. The crackling of the fire and the eerie shadows it created added to the spooky atmosphere. The air was thick with a sense of foreboding, and even the simplest of sounds seemed amplified in the stillness of the night. We roasted hot dogs for dinner, but the taste was overshadowed by the spine-tingling tales we shared. Around midnight, we decided to put out the fire and get ready to turn in for the night, eager to wake up early for a hike the next morning. Just as we were about to retreat to our separate tents, we heard a rustling noise coming from the bushes. "Did you hear that?" Henson asked, his voice tinged with unease. "Yeah, I did," I replied, my heart beginning to race. "Rabbit," Bruce retorted dismissively as he walked back to his tent. Henson and I stood there for a moment, scanning the trees, but saw nothing. Reluctantly, we turned and started walking back towards our tents. Suddenly, a low, guttural growl echoed out of the forest, making every hair on my body stand on end. I spun around, but still saw nothing. That's when Bruce turned his flashlight on, and there, in the beam of light, I saw them. A pair of glowing eyes, staring back at us from the bushes, unblinking and menacing. My heart pounded as we heard the creature emerge from the shadows. "I'm grabbing my rifle," Bruce shouted as he ran towards his tent, but the creature let out a howl so deafening that it brought us all to our knees, wincing in pain. The sound seemed to pierce through the very fabric of the night, leaving an eerie silence in its wake. I slowly looked up, bracing myself to face the beast that I was certain would attack and kill us. It resembled a wolf, a gray wolf, but it was massive and stood on its hind legs. The creature was no shorter than 8 feet tall. I could see its huge fangs, with saliva glistening in the moonlight, dripping onto the ground. Its eyes burned with a feral intensity, and its fur bristled as it growled, sending shivers down my spine. The creature took a step closer, and that's when Bruce fired. He fired again and again, but then there was silence. I opened my eyes to see the creature still standing there, unscathed. It let out another bone-chilling howl before sprinting in our direction with terrifying speed. My friends and I aren't dumb. We took off running towards our trucks. My heart raced with fear as we ran, the creature's footsteps pounding the ground behind us, growing louder with each passing second. I could hear its breath, ragged and menacing, as it closed in on us. The pounding of my heart reverberated throughout my ears, almost drowning out the sounds of our frantic escape. I glanced back and saw it gaining on us with tremendous intensity. Its eyes glowed with malevolent hatred as it clawed its way towards us. In my panic, I stumbled and tripped over a tree root. Henson quickly turned around to help me up, and just as I could run again, I felt an intense, burning sensation across my back. I cried out in agony, but didn't dare stop running, the creature's growls echoing in the darkness behind us. We finally reached our trucks. I fumbled with my keys, my hands uncontrollably shaking. I managed to get inside, slam my door shut, and lock it just as the creature lunged at my car. It pounded on my roof with such force that the entire vehicle shook, its growls and screams echoing through the night, sending chills down my spine. Then it jumped to the hood of my car, its eyes glowing with a sinister light. It started beating on my windshield, each blow causing cracks to spiderweb across the glass. I screamed as the creature's claws tore through the windshield, shards of glass flying everywhere. In a desperate move, I quickly unlocked my door and leaped out into the bed of Bruce's truck as he was pulling out. Bruce and Henson both sped away as fast as they could, tires screeching against the dirt. I stared in horror as the creature just stood there, still perched on the hood of my truck, its eyes locked onto mine. To this day, we don't know what that creature was. I know what I believe it is. We all agree on one thing. We'll never go camping in those woods again. The memory of that night still haunts me, and I can't shake the feeling that the creature is still out there, lurking in the shadows, waiting for its next unsuspecting victims. A few weeks later, I couldn't get the experience out of my mind, so I decided to do some research. I found old legends and folklore about the area, speaking of a beast that roamed the woods, a creature that was neither man nor animal. Locals called it the Wendigo, a spirit of the wilderness that preyed on those who ventured too deep into its territory. The stories described it as a cursed being, transformed by its insatiable hunger and thirst for blood. I shared my findings with my friends, and we all felt a shiver run down our spines. The descriptions matched what we had seen that night, down to the last horrifying detail. We realized how close we had come to becoming another story in the local folklore, another set of names whispered around campfires. The thought of that creature still lurking in the woods, waiting for its next prey, was too much to bear. We made a pact never to speak of that night again, hoping that by staying silent, we could somehow escape its grasp. The silence was our shield, a fragile barrier against the terror that stalked the shadows. But every now and then, when the wind howls through the trees, I can't help but remember those glowing eyes and the terror we felt. The Wendigo is still out there, somewhere in the dark, waiting, and sometimes late at night I wonder if it remembers us too. The thought sends a chill down my spine, making me question whether silence is enough to keep the darkness at bay. Sixth story. My possible Wendigo sighting, Montrose, Colorado. Tonight, I was discussing this extremely weird and terrifying experience my friend and I had when we gave someone a ride home. To give in more context of what happened and why I stated possible sighting. I live on the western slope of Colorado, and I'm an avid marijuana user, especially when I'm up late with a friend working on a Dungeons & Dragons campaign. So it's really difficult for me to say it's real being under the influence. The strange thing about it is how my friend and I felt and saw. It was in late spring, and we were working on a campaign late in the evening, and we got the munchies. I know. How can we be more stereotypical? My friend only lives 4 blocks away from a gas station, and it can be accessed from side streets. Being under the influence, I did not want to take a main street or go far at all. It wasn't responsible of me, and excusing using side streets doesn't justify it. Again, I know it was irresponsible of me. But moving on. As we were leaving the convenience store, my friend was stopped by a woman he knew growing up, and she was close friends with his mother. She was extremely intoxicated and alone, so my friend offered her a ride home to make sure she got back safe. Now here's where things got really weird. Without conversing with each other, my friend and I both felt like she was not safe to walk. I played this off as being a woman in her 60s or early 70s, intoxicated and completely alone. She claimed it was only up the block away, but it was actually a few miles outside of town. It would have easily taken her over a few hours for her to get home. Being in a small town, we have no Uber, Lyft, and taxis are pretty much triple the price at this hour. So we both felt really off that she was okay to walk that far, at 1:30 in the morning. When we get down the road from her place, she asked us to drop her off away from her place so that her boyfriend doesn't see our headlights. This point, I didn't want to go into anything further, and there was so many red flags about the situation, I knew it's best to just drop her off as requested and go back to my friend's house. As I reversed down this single-lane dirt road, I told my friend that I'm going to just pull over before we get back into town because I really needed to use the bathroom, and we then both agreed that she was in a very bad situation tonight. Once I turned around this bend in the road, my headlights shined into a small group of trees and bushes. I noticed this extremely large elk-like creature lowering itself from being exposed from my headlights. I could make out the face, but it wasn't normal like an elk. Large antlers, it came off like dead tree branches. The front legs were inverted, skinny, and extremely long. I could tell because its hind legs and lower half were lower than its upper body. Could have been crouching or sitting, though. Upper torso was huge, and I thought I saw stripes on its fur, but my friend said it looked like it was its rib cage exposed. The eyes did reflect from when the high beams exposed it in the trees, and at first, I assumed it was an elk because they're everywhere in this area. But it was extremely huge, easily over 15 foot tall but thin. I didn't immediately react to it and kept driving, but when I did see it, the conversation between my friend and I stopped as if we both saw it and trying to process it. After I pulled off to use the restroom roughly a mile away from where I saw that, I couldn't help but to keep looking down the road, making sure that creature wasn't coming after us. It was a feeling I never experienced before, and when I turned around to get back into the car, I couldn't help but notice my friend staring down the road as well, doing the exact same thing I was doing. I asked him if he saw something as well, and he said what he saw was something that looked like the forest spirit in the Studio Ghibli movie Princess Mononoke, but from hell. At this point, my fear was validated, and I jumped into the car and sped off. The feeling we both had was more than a sense of dread, and almost like we were being hunted, or if we were to investigate it at the time, our lives would have been in danger. I never in my life felt this type of fear before, and it was a new experience that I never in my life was to have. I'm glad she made it safe, and we were in the right place at the right time to give her the help she needed. After that situation, I was informed about her life of substance use and struggles, that it's actually gotten worse over the years. Ever since that night, my friend and I dealt with lots of personal things very similar. Our marijuana use increased to cope with major depression, suicidal ideation, death in family, and just overall rough times since that night. I struggle to claim there is some association with what we saw that night, but it's very strange how our lives got increasingly worse since. I tried doing research on WENDIGO and even SKINWALKER, but I get a lot of stories that's hard to take in as real encounters and would love to learn more on them. 7th story. Never again will I go backcountry camping. This is my personal account of an incident that occurred in Alaska back in 2019. I haven't spoken of this incident to anyone but my therapist and my best friend. Despite many sessions and even attempts of exposure therapy, which I will explain later, this event still haunts me. Maybe if I post this here, I can gain some semblance of peace. So like I said, it was 2019. I was 25 at the time. I had been saving up money to do on some backcountry camping up in Alaska. I live on the East Coast, and while my job was paying all right, I was taking up some under-the-table jobs, house painting, house sitting, pet sitting, and what have you, to help me out financially for the trip. I also had a friend set me up with their uncle, who is a bush pilot, to handle getting me to and from my camping location. This was my first and biggest mistake. Now, I had very little experience with camping outside of occasional weekend camping at state parks, and I did some camping excursions, nothing super challenging, when I was in Boy Scouts. But my friend's uncle, Mark, knew some good spots that were remote to an extent, but easy to get to in the event of an emergency, by bush plane standards, that is. So yeah, no trekking to the nearest highway or road, unless I wanted to walk for a day or so through rugged terrain. My parents helped me out with getting me some emergency supplies, food/hydration packs, first aid kit, bear spray, etc. Mark loaned me a spare rifle of his, in case I would need it. Even though I was a non-resident, I could still carry a firearm under state law. I've hunted before when I was a teen, so I had experience in that regard, plus I didn't have to worry about the hassle of transporting a firearm and dealing with airport regulations. Mark also hooked me up with a satellite phone as well, so my cell phone was going to be nothing more than a camera. I didn't have the money for a good camera for photography or anything, so I had to make do. The plan was to be dropped off at where I was camping, camp out for 5 days, and be picked up on day 6. I didn't want to use up all 2 weeks of my allotted PTO at work, so I kept the trip condensed. Because this was my first time out, Mark helped me pick out a site based on his recommendations. The spot he chose wasn't one he went to often, as he typically flew in hunters and anglers who typically were going to areas with more rugged terrain. It was relatively flat, not a lot of dense forests, maybe some patches here and there further in, and my campsite was going to be set up near a small lake with a good view of some mountains in the distance. Now, I'm sure a lot of people would like to know where I was specifically, but Mark no longer takes people to that location, regardless of their experience or not, and he no longer does fly-ins for anyone who isn't a hunter. It hurt his business a bit, because fishing is so popular in Alaska, but he ended up retiring altogether due to COVID the following year. As for why I won't mention the location, as far as I am aware, the location didn't have a name on an official map, and if Mark had ever flown near that area, it was just a tiny blip during a scenic sightseeing trip. The other reason was because of what I experienced on that trip. What I saw, I wish I could get it out of my head, out of my dreams. After Mark dropped me off and helped me unload my gear, I spent most of my first day setting up camp, not far from the lake, a good 85 yards or so, or a little over 77 meters. I found a nice and remarkably dry dead log that had some good-sized branches, so that was my main supply of firewood. A short walk away, there was a small grove of trees inland from the lake that I set up as my food storage location. Mark said bears were not uncommon in this area, though not necessarily the best place to see some, but it was still advised to keep food hanging from a tree, out of reach from any potential bears. The lake had a rather unique shape to it, which made it easy for me to set up a good spot for a cooking area. For those unfamiliar, the campsite, food storage, and kitchen area should form a triangle, which some people refer to as a Bermuda Triangle. Day 2 and 3 were not entirely uneventful for the most part. Day 2, I was eating lunch at my campsite while watching a bull moose dive into the lake to eat the plants at the bottom. Day 3, I did some hiking, found a small hill with only a couple trees on top, and I decided to sit down and observe a herd of elk grazing for a good while. Exploring around the lake, I found a small rusted boat buried under some branches. It was in rough shape, but could still float on the water. So I dragged it back with me to camp and put it near the lakeshore. Figured I could go out on the lake and take some good photos from it. Day 4 is when things started to get weird. It got unnaturally quiet that morning. The birds were not singing, and the only sounds were from the lake and the bugs. Despite making sure I packed mosquito repellent, the bugs were a big nuisance if I was near the lake. I hesitated to travel away from my tent, outside of walking to the lake. I tried not to let the silence bother me, and I occupied my time with reading inside my tent. As the sun dipped down and darkness began to creep in, I was starting to feel uneasy, like a primal kind of fear. I decided I was going to make my campfire a bit bigger than I normally make it, enough that the light shone further away. As I turned in for the night, I made sure my bear spray and the rifle were within reach inside my tent. But I had trouble sleeping. The silence was unnerving. I was fighting myself not to toss and turn, because I was too afraid of the noise attracting something I did not want to encounter alone at night. Just as I was about to close my eyes, I heard a branch snap. That woke me up faster than a bucket of ice water, and I immediately froze. I could hear something coming into my campsite. I reached for the bear spray and held it tightly to my chest. As slowly as humanly possible, I turned over and saw the shadow of an animal on the wall of my tent, illuminated by the glow of the moonlight. The animal was big, about the size of a trophy brown bear, but the silhouette looked off. I just figured it was from some sort of distortion from the angle I was looking at. But the noises it made were not like that of a bear. It made huffing noises like a bear, but the sound wasn't exactly the same. I could tell it was starting to approach my tent, so I had my thumb ready on the safety catch of the spray. Suddenly, the creature tore through the tent like tissue paper and grabbed my sleeping bag in its jaws. The strength of the animal caused me to nearly hit my head off the ground, and for a brief moment, I caught a look at the animal's face. The animal's head looked similar to a bear's, but there was something uncanny about it, uncanny in a way that I cannot entirely articulate. It wasn't malformed or anything, it just looked off. As the animal dragged me out of the tent, I popped off the safety catch and sprayed it in the face. The animal reeled back, groaning in pain. It was a horrendous noise, not like anything I have ever heard. I heard it run off into the thick brush, and as I went to head for the remains of my tent, I could hear this crashing and cracking noise from the animal. I was too scared that it was going to come back, so I ran for the boat. As I was pushing the boat into the water, I turned back, and from the fading glow of the campfire, I saw the animal begin to charge. I wasted no time in getting the boat into the water, and I began to paddle as quickly as I could. I knew the creature would be faster, but I was praying that I got far enough away from shore it wouldn't attempt to chase me. The creature didn't stop at the lakeshore, and it made its way through the water, at least up to its chest, and stopped. I could faintly see it from the moonlight, and then it ran for my tent. While I couldn't see it all that well, I could tell from the horrendous noise that the animal was thrashing around my camping supplies. I hoped to God that the rifle and satellite phone were intact. I curled up in the boat and tried my best to sleep, but I was drenched up to my waist and I was shivering like crazy. After a good 15 minutes, the noises from my campsite died down and everything became still again. I never slept through the night, but occasionally would paddle the boat to make sure it didn't float off towards shore during the night. When morning approached, I was still too afraid to go back to my campsite. I waited until around noon when my stomach began to protest. I picked up the paddle and slowly and as quietly as possible paddled back to my campsite. As I reached the shore, I still waited for several minutes, just to make sure I didn't hear the creature approach. I slowly walked back to what remained of my campsite. The tent was nothing more than snapped poles and tattered fabric, and what was left of my sleeping bag was unrecognizable as belonging to a sleeping bag. Unfortunately, Mark's rifle had a busted stock, and the wooden forearm had a big crack down it. My backpack had been torn apart, and clothes and gear were scattered all around. I found my binoculars laying in the fire pit. Luckily, it looked like the fire had gone out before they landed in it, as there were no scorch marks on them. One of the lenses was cracked, but were still usable. I scoped out the food cache area, only to find my food cache missing, and some busted branches around the trees. I quickly grabbed a small backpack that was missing a strap and quickly stuffed some clothes into it and the binoculars. I searched around the campsite for anything else of use. The satellite phone was still in its pouch in what was left of the larger backpack, so I grabbed that and a couple emergency flares. I would pause every few moments, just to make sure the creature from last night didn't show up. My bear spray can lay over by the dead log, and as I went over to grab it, that's when I heard a low growl coming from the thicket. I froze. If I had been wearing a t-shirt at the time, I would have seen the goosebumps that covered my arms. I slowly began backing away from my campsite back to the rusted boat, and that's when it emerged from the brush. It had the appearance of a bear, but like how you would probably envision a bear in your dreams. It had an uncanniness to its appearance that I am unable to describe. My mind was trying to make sense of what I was seeing, and part of me was, and still is, wondering if the sleepless night was messing with my vision. My legs were beginning to shake, and tears were streaming down my face as it watched me. I was terrified of what it might do next. The animal lumbered towards me, and I tossed a lit flare at it, in the hopes it would scare the creature off. It backed off momentarily. I took the opportunity to run for the boat. Bad idea when dealing with a predator, I know, but I managed to get the boat back towards the deeper water as it stopped at chest-level water like the night before. The animal watched me, its eyes burning with an intense fury that I have never seen in an animal before. It ran back to shore and turned, and began swiping at the ground with its paws. When I saw the claws, I dreaded to think what injuries they would be capable of inflicting on me. I reached down to grab the paddle, only to find it gone. I looked up to see it laying on the pebbly surface of the shoreline. I began to cry. I was typically not an emotional person at the time, but here, I could do nothing but bawl my eyes out. I was absolutely terrified. I looked around, and I saw what appeared to be a branch from a dead tree jutting out of the water not far from shore, but seemingly far enough away the animal wouldn't reach me unless it was very determined. I used my hands to clumsily steer the boat towards it, and could see the creature lumbering along the shoreline, following me. I screamed at it to go away, but the animal was unfazed by my shouts and screams. When I reached the branch, I looked up and saw that the animal was gone. I looked around the shoreline. I wasn't terribly far from where my campsite had been, and I didn't see any trace of the creature. I accidentally kicked my foot back and heard a thud. I froze, and again, I heard the crashing and snapping of branches in the thicket. I pushed the boat away from the log and back towards the deeper water. The creature again appeared on the shoreline and let out a horrendous-sounding roar. I never heard an animal sound like that before. It was such an awful roar that I flinched in fear. I bent over and clamped my hands around my ears. I was doing everything to keep the image and sound of that animal out of my head. I was cold, wet, and alone in the Alaskan wilderness, and I was being terrorized by something that was an indescribable approximation of a bear. I heard my foot thud again, and I felt around, at first thinking it was part of the boat. I felt a handle, and out from under my seat was a metal box with a padlock on it. That wasn't even locked. I carefully took off the padlock and opened the box, and inside was a vintage camping shovel. Looked to be military surplus. It wasn't perfect, but the closest alternative to a paddle. I slowly began heading down the lake towards a river. I looked over my shoulder, and the creature was continuing to follow me. I had never seen an animal this intent before. My mind was racing through so many thoughts. Was it an animal? A monster? I reached into my pack and pulled out the satellite phone. Battery still had enough juice, and I immediately called Mark and, despite my sobbing voice and him trying to calm me down, said he'd get out to me as soon as he can and told me to keep an eye on the creature. Mark believed I was being stalked by a bear. Once again, the sun began to dip down, and I was enveloped in darkness as clouds started to block out the moon. Somehow, I was able to fall asleep. Woke up once in the middle of the night, thinking the animal had gotten to me, but after an excruciatingly long period of silence, waved it off as a fish. When dawn came, I found my boat started to drift towards shore. I looked around, didn't see any sign of the animal. I gathered my remaining belongings and, after looking for landmarks that Mark advised me on, trekked to where he was going to meet me at. That was the scariest 3 hours of my life. All I could think of was that animal stalking me. I completely forgot to even be aware of other animals like moose. As I crested a hilltop, I could see Mark's plane in a flat meadow, and I just booked it for the plane as fast as I was able to. Mark rushed over and helped with my belongings, a rifle slung over his shoulder. Once again, I heard the familiar crashing sound of something in the brush near the hill I was on, and Mark readied his rifle as I got into the plane. We both saw the animal rear up on its hind legs and roar at us. Again, the way it was postured was so different from how a bear stands up. Mark quickly hopped in the plane just as the animal charged. However, Mark was able to get his plane airborne long before the animal could reach us, and I only caught one last glimpse of it before it fled back into the brush. I asked Mark what was wrong with that bear, and he just replied, his voice shaking, something I had never seen the 61-year-old man do in the time I knew him. I don't know what that was, but that wasn't a fucking bear. After we reached civilization, Mark swore he would never bring anyone to that area again, and I would be his first and last camper flight. I think we both regret the inexperience. Alaska Fish and Game were notified of the situation, but when they investigated the scene, they found only the remains of the campsite and some of my gear. They did recover some items that were still usable, but unfortunately, due to heavy rainstorms a few days after the incident, they could not find any footprints, or even fur, of the creature officially, it was logged as a bear incident. And with Mark explaining that the region wasn't particularly a prime area for excursions, Fish and Game decided there was no need to look into it further. Mark and I are the only ones to have seen this creature. And unfortunately, neither of us were able to describe the animal to Fish and Wildlife, because both of us would break down into tears before we could get far enough into the description. When I came back to the continental U.S., I went through a few years of therapy, mostly video calls due to COVID, but after things started opening back up, my therapist was taking me to zoos to see bears for exposure therapy, but it was fruitless. People thought I just had a scary encounter with a big brown bear. But I know better. There's something up there in Alaska. I don't know what it is, but I pray to God every day that someone else doesn't have a run-in with it. 8th story. I'm at a skinwalker in Blackwood Forest. I've always loved solo camping. The isolation of Blackwood Forest has always offered a perfect escape from the relentless grind of city life. My name is Jake, and solitude is where I find my peace. My job in finance is demanding, and the constant pressure and deadlines leave me yearning for these wilderness retreats. Every few months, I pack up my gear and head into the forest, which has always felt like a second home. Until this trip, I had never experienced anything unusual in those woods. But this time, something felt different from the moment I arrived. The forest seemed darker, more oppressive. The trees loomed like silent sentinels, their gnarled branches casting eerie shadows. Despite this, I brushed off the unease and set up camp, determined to enjoy my weekend retreat. By dusk, I had my tent pitched in a small clearing and was gathering wood for the fire. The process was almost meditative, a familiar routine that usually helped ground me. As twilight deepened, the forest came alive with the sounds of nature settling in. The first stars appeared, their distant twinkle stark against the enveloping darkness. The fire crackled to life, its warm glow offering a small measure of comfort. I settled into my chair with a beer, trying to relax and embrace the tranquility. But tonight, the usual sounds of the forest, the chirping crickets, rustling leaves, felt more menacing than soothing. It was as if the forest had a heartbeat, each noise echoing unsettlingly close. The vibrant rustle of leaves seemed to carry a darker undertone, and even the crackle of the fire sounded hollow. I tried to lose myself in a book, but the growing darkness seemed to seep into my thoughts. Every gust of wind and snap of a twig kept me on edge. I checked my watch repeatedly, the minutes dragging as night deepened. The shadows grew longer, creeping up on the edges of my firelight, and the once comforting flicker of the flames began to feel inadequate against the encroaching darkness. As the night wore on, the noises grew stranger and more unnerving. The crickets' chorus faded into silence. The wind died down, and the rustling leaves ceased. The usual nighttime symphony was replaced by a suffocating silence. An oppressive stillness settled over the area, amplifying every creak and groan of the woods. The silence felt heavy, almost like it was pressing in from all sides. Then, a low, guttural growl pierced the darkness. It seemed to vibrate through the ground, resonating deep within my chest. My heart pounded, and a cold sweat broke out on my forehead. I scanned the darkness beyond the firelight, trying to locate the source. "What was that?" I muttered, barely above a whisper. My voice felt strange in the silence, almost like an intruder. I grabbed my flashlight and directed its beam into the darkness. The light fell on something, a shape just beyond the fire's edge. At first, it looked like a deer, partially obscured by shadows. But as I squinted, I saw its eyes. They glowed an unnatural red, piercing through the darkness with a malevolent gleam. A chill crept up my spine. "Hello," I called out, hoping for a rational explanation. The creature remained still. Then, it let out a scream, an unearthly wail that defied explanation. It started as a deep, resonant cry, like someone in immense pain, and then morphed into a high-pitched shriek that echoed through the forest like a banshee's lament. The sound felt like it was tearing through my sanity, growing louder and more distorted the more I struggled to comprehend it. It was as if the scream was feeding off my fear, intensifying with each passing moment. I stumbled back, dropping my flashlight. The beam flickered and died, plunging me into darkness. I fumbled with my tent's zipper, my hands shaking uncontrollably. Inside the tent, I tried to calm myself, but my heart pounded so hard I could barely breathe. I grabbed my hunting knife, trying to reassure myself that I was safe. But the forest had other plans. The minutes stretched into hours, and every rustle of leaves or snap of a twig outside made me jump. I tried to stay awake, my eyes darting around the dark interior of the tent, but exhaustion began to take its toll. I dozed off, only to be jolted awake by a sound that made my blood run cold. That same guttural growl, now much closer. My heart raced as I held my breath, straining to listen. Something was moving outside my tent, circling it slowly. The sound of its footsteps was heavy, deliberate. Then, I heard a voice, eerily like my own, but twisted and distorted. "Jake, come out and play." I froze, unable to comprehend how it knew my name. The voice continued, repeating my name in a way that was both familiar and horrifyingly wrong. It sounded like someone was mimicking me, but couldn't get it quite right, each repetition more garbled and unsettling than the last. Summoning all my courage, I unzipped the tent just enough to peek outside. The fire had long since burned down to embers, casting eerie shadows on the trees. My flashlight lay where I'd dropped it, its beam flickering weakly. And then I saw it. The creature stood at the edge of the clearing, its form shifting and contorting. One moment it looked like a deer, the next it resembled a monstrous version of a human. Its limbs elongated and twisted at unnatural angles, its skin rippling and crawling as if something underneath was trying to escape. Its eyes, still glowing that hellish red, locked onto mine. "Jake, come out." It took a step closer, and I saw the blood. Its mouth and hands were smeared with it, and in its hand it held something small and dripping. My stomach churned as I realized it was a rabbit, its body torn apart, entrails dangling like grotesque ornaments. I scrambled back, tripping over my gear, my mind racing. Skinwalker. The term surfaced from some long-buried memory of campfire stories. Creatures that mimic human voices, take on the appearance of animals, and wear the skin of their prey. My skin prickled with fear. The creature began to tear at the tent, its claws ripping through the fabric with a horrifying ease. I slashed at it with my knife, feeling the blade connect with something solid. It screamed again, that same inhuman wail that made my ears ring and my blood run cold. I bolted from the tent, running blindly into the forest. Branches whipped at my face and arms as I tore through the underbrush. My lungs burned, my breath coming in ragged gasps. I could hear it behind me, crashing through the trees, getting closer. I stumbled into a clearing and saw an old, abandoned cabin. Desperation fueled my steps as I ran inside, slamming the door behind me. The cabin was dark and musty, the air thick with decay. The silence inside was almost as oppressive as the sounds outside. I could hear the creature scratching at the walls, circling, searching for a way in. The scratching was relentless, a constant reminder of the danger just beyond the walls. I backed into a corner, clutching my knife, every nerve in my body screaming for escape. Hours passed, the scratching and growling outside relentless. Just when I thought I couldn't take it anymore, dawn broke, light filtering through the cracks in the walls. The noises stopped. I waited, holding my breath, until I was sure it was gone. I slowly made my way outside, my body trembling with fatigue and fear. The forest was eerily silent. My camp was a wreck. My tent was shredded, my gear scattered and torn. The fire pit was nothing more than a blackened scar on the ground. The surrounding trees seemed to bear witness to the chaos that had unfolded. I quickly grabbed what was left of my belongings, my movements frantic. The sense of urgency was overpowering. I couldn't get out of those woods fast enough. My steps were hasty, my mind racing as I pushed through the dense underbrush, the feeling of being watched never leaving me. Once I reached the edge of the forest, I didn't stop. I kept moving until the trees were nothing more than a distant line behind me. I didn't dare look back, fearing that the thing might still be out there, lurking just beyond my sight. I don't know what that thing was, but I'll never go back to Blackwood Forest. Sometimes, late at night, I still hear that voice in my head calling my name in that twisted, mocking tone. I wonder if it's out there, waiting for me to make another mistake. The thought is a constant, gnawing dread, a reminder of the darkness that lies hidden in the places we think we know best. It's a fear that has taken root deep within me, an unsettling echo of an encounter I can never fully escape. Thanks a lot for watching the video till the end. Subscribe to our channel Horror in Detail. Drop your opinions/suggestions in the comment section, and like the video as it helps with the YouTube algorithm.